economy is mired in a deep recession, interest rates skyrocketing, unemployment on the rise.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
Promising to restore America's greatness, Ronald Reagan becomes president. By his side, his wife, Nancy.
If there was one person who was indispensable to Ronald Reagan's political success, it was Nancy Reagan.
He would have never become governor without her. He probably would never become president of the United States without her.
Together, they went from the backlots of Hollywood to the governor's mansion in California and then on to the White House. For Nancy Reagan, being First Lady was the role of a lifetime.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Annenberg Foundation, the Lux Foundation, and these other foundations and individuals. And
this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Judy Woodruff. In the 1980s, I covered President and Mrs. Reagan while they were here at the White House. In his 8 years in office, Ronald Reagan was a transformational figure, changing international and domestic policy and American politics in profound ways. It wasn't fully understood at the time, but his wife Nancy was enormously powerful in her own right. It was looking out for Ronald Reagan that gave Nancy power. Though it was often unseen, she had far-reaching influence within the president's administration. Historians have now concluded that Nancy Reagan was one of the most influential first ladies in modern times. She was shrewd, politically savvy, a force to be reckoned with.
I see the First Lady as another means to keep the President from being isolated. I talk to people, they tell me things, and if something is about to become a problem, I'm not above calling a staff person and asking about it. I'm a woman who loves her husband, and I make no apologies for looking out for his personal and political welfare.
Now 89, she lives in California, where she sat down with us for a rare interview. Over the next hour, we will look at her life and role as First Lady. Anne Frances Robbins was born on July 6, 1921, in a New York City hospital. Her mother nicknamed her Nancy.
When she had me, she got to the hospital and they said, "We don't have room for you." And she said, "Oh, really? Well, then I'll just lie down here and have my baby." Well, of course, then they found the room. We didn't fool around with Mother.
Edith Luckett was an actress who traveled around the country performing with friends and upcoming movie stars like Spencer Tracy and Walter Houston.
She was very vivacious and charming, and she had a great sense of humor, which sometimes veered into the off-color.
Nancy's father, Kenneth Robbins, was an insurance salesman.
Kenneth Robbins was not a man of great ambition. Edith, on the other hand, wanted to be a huge movie star. They were kind of mismatched.
Soon they divorced. Edith continued acting, but realized it was hard to work with a small child backstage. At age 2, Nancy was sent to live with Edith's sister and her husband. Virginia and Audley Galbraith lived in Bethesda, Maryland.
My mother was outgoing and funny, and her sister was retiring and shy and always called her husband Mr. Galbraith.
Nancy always looked forward to the days when her mother took time out from Broadway to visit.
That was a big day for everybody, not just me, everybody. She'd tell us all the latest things and teach us all the latest dances and the Charleston, and oh, she was so darling.
As a young girl separated from her mother, she often missed her, like the time Nancy had pneumonia.
I said, well, if I ever have a little girl and she gets sick, I'll certainly be with her. Terrible thing to say.
As much as she always likes to say that her mother did not abandon her, her mother was wonderful on on an emotional level, I think it was hurtful and created a need in her for stability.
In May of 1929, at age 7, Nancy Robbins would finally get that stability when her mother married Chicago neurosurgeon Dr. Loyal Davis. Edith Luckett gave up acting and devoted herself to promoting her husband's career.
Growing up in Chicago, Nancy was really surrounded by women who believed in marriage and put their marriages and their husbands before everything else, and seemed to realize that the more they enhanced their husbands, the more they enhanced themselves.
Although Chicago was especially hard hit by the Depression, Nancy was largely unaffected. She lived in a wealthy enclave known as the Gold Coast and attended an exclusive private school, Girls Latin.
Her whole life took place within about 12 very prosperous blocks. The only time she would have even seen poor people was when they would go downtown to the Loop to see a movie.
Nancy pressed Dr. Loyal to adopt her, but he resisted because her real father was still alive. By age 16, she finally got her way.
My birth father was going to be in New York, so I met him and my grandmother and told them what I wanted to do. I really felt sorry for my grandmother because I knew it was a terrible, terrible disappointment to her. But they signed the papers and that was done.
That was a very determined thing to do at that age. Nancy knew what she wanted, and she got it. Even in school, people said she became the leader.
Now, going by the name of Nancy Davis, she goes to Smith College to major in drama. In 1944, her love of acting takes her to New York City. It takes a year for Nancy to land her first acting job, but her mother's connections helped.
It was hard, but I knew a lot of people. My first job was with Mary Martin in Luzon.
The director of the play thought she wasn't very talented and knew she had been given the part because of her parents' friendship with Mary Martin. And when the director suggested firing Nancy, Mary Martin said, "No way."
After acting in several plays, Nancy Davis goes to Hollywood for an MGM screen test. In 1949, she is offered a 7-year contract.
It was a top studio, and I was thrilled to be there. Once you were under contract, you could take lessons in French, in singing, in writing, whatever. Nancy mainly gets parts playing the nice girl, like the pregnant housewife in The Next Voice You Hear, and the faithful socialite in East Side, West Side. I had a scene with Barbara Stanwyck, who was a huge star, and I was very nervous because I had one long speech that I just delivered to her. And I was so scared because I'd heard so much about her.
I'm concerned about you, and I'm afraid to ask. I'm afraid you'll think I'm prying.
But after I'd done it, and they cut, she congratulated me, so I thought, oh, my day is made.
In the late 1940s, Hollywood is embroiled in an anti-communist fervor. Congress investigates movie makers suspected of having communist sympathies. Some are blacklisted and unable to work. While filming East Side, West Side, Nancy Davis is shocked to see her name appear in a Hollywood newspaper among a list of so-called communist sympathizers. Concerned about her career, she asks her producer, Mervyn LeRoy, for help.
He said, "I'll call Ronald Reagan. He's president of the Screen Actors Guild. And of course, he'll be able to do something." Now I heard the name Ronald Reagan, and I thought, oh yes, Mervyn, that's absolutely what you should do.
She had sort of had her sights set on Ronald Reagan for some time. She had made a list of eligible bachelors in LA, and his name was on the top of it.
Reagan asks Nancy out to dinner to discuss her problem.
He said, "But it has to be an early dinner because I have an early morning call." I said, "That's perfectly all right. I have an early morning call, too."
After After dinner, he suggests they go to a nightclub.
And he said, well, let's just go for the first show. But that's all. So we went to the first show, and of course we stayed for the second show, and by that time we both knew neither one of us had an early morning call.
She was immediately drawn to this actor who was already involved in a variety of political and civic causes.
He was unlike any actor I'd ever known. Never talked about himself. Had a whole world out there that he was involved with. He was very appealing to me. Good looking and attractive. I just wanted to know more about him.
Reagan was also an avid horseman and owned a ranch where he and Nancy began to spend a lot of time.
I met Ronnie, and I found out that he was interested in horses, so I told him that, of course, I was mad about horses myself.
Did you see her?
One of the ways Nancy Davis won her way into Ronald Reagan's heart was by going out to the ranch every weekend and painting the fence, because he himself had built this enormous fence around this huge property, and she was there painting pickets weekend after weekend.
After dating for almost 3 years, they married privately in a small ceremony on March 4th, 1952. In the early 1950s, Reagan's movie career was waning, and he was forced to travel to look for work. While on the road in New York, he writes a romantic letter to his wife, a practice he continues throughout their lives. Man can't live without a heart, and you are my heart. There would be no life without you, nor would I want any. I love you. Signed, the eastern half of us. In 1954, Reagan is offered a job as host of the General Electric Theater on NBC.
His contract calls for him to go around the country and talk to people in the GE plants. And he writes these speeches. And he also learns how to respond to audiences. So he is getting a political training that is unique and, in some ways, unsurpassed.
Really, if you had planned to go into politics, this was certainly the way to do it. But that wasn't his plan.
Ronnie has his own special radio, too.
Yeah, it's around here someplace. I have to do a lot of traveling, you know.
Too much to suit me.
Well, I feel the same way.
General Electric builds a house in Southern California for the Reagans and their 2 children, Patty and Ron, loaded with all the latest appliances.
It did have every electronic gadget known to man in this house. General Electric made sure it was the show house, of course. And so we had curtains that were electronically and lights that would come on and, hidden places. It was quite impressive for the 50s and 60s.
And I'm going to play a record now just to show you.
During those days in Southern California, Reagan becomes increasingly conservative. And Nancy begins building relationships with the wives of wealthy Republican businessmen. This core group supports the Reagans throughout their political lives.
She oriented their whole social life towards the wives of the men who kind of ran the Republican Party in Los Angeles. She prepared the way for him. She made the connections that made a political career possible.
In 1964, while campaigning for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, Reagan gives a groundbreaking speech.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll...
It's such a sensation that his Republican backers pay to televise it nationally.
Well, then he was asked to run for governor. He hadn't planned on running for governor at all. He was talked into it.
In his run for office, Reagan hired political strategist Stu Spencer, who stayed with him throughout his political career. Spencer quickly learned he'd be working with Nancy, too.
Nancy was in every meeting. Early on, she didn't say much, didn't even ask a lot of questions. She listened. And as I look back on it, I think she was evaluating us the whole time.
This is not a normal political wife in the sense that, yes, honey, if you want to run, fine, I'll support you, This is somebody who's part of a team.
With the votes counted, it's a smashing victory for Reagan.
In 1966, the actor-turned-politician is elected governor of California.
If I start to say what's really in my heart, I'm afraid I'll start to cry. So thank you very much.
Doe-eyed and soft-spoken, Mrs. Reagan hardly seems ready for the rough-and-tumble world of politics.
I don't think she was prepared for political life. The studios had controlled most of the publicity, and she came from a relatively sheltered life, as all political wives must suffer from the slings and arrows of the opposition and the media. She just felt it, she took it personally, always.
As a conservative, Reagan proposes controversial changes and often comes under fire from the largely Democratic legislature. At first, Nancy struggles with his critics.
They would run these cartoons of the governor, and she would call up the newspaper and protest. I mean, she really wasn't handling it too well.
What happened to that honeymoon period that they told me that we were going to have?
Nancy doesn't want to live in the old governor's mansion, which is largely considered a fire trap. A controversy erupts when the Reagans move into a house with a pool in a wealthier neighborhood. Politicians accuse the Reagans of being elitist and ignoring tradition. It doesn't help when the Reagans' rich campaign supporters buy their new house and rent it back to the first couple. The First Lady is surprised that the flap over their new home makes front-page news. But she's devastated when a Saturday Evening Post profile refers to her as a woman who seems to be playing out some middle-class woman's daydream circa 1948, and calls her smile a study in frozen insincerity.
It's kind of a mean piece. I mean, even those of us who were not Nancy fans at the time thought this was over the top.
While many women are demanding jobs and equal pay in the 1960s, Nancy Reagan openly professes marriage to be her primary goal.
Did you ever think that you'd be so much in the public eye when you were young?
No, never.
What did you want to be or do?
I just wanted to be married.
But there is positive press. The First Lady of California is lauded on the society pages. Look magazine does a full spread on the fashionable Nancy Reagan, calling her warm and friendly. And the Los Angeles Times names her Woman of the Year in 19